Hello and welcome to Frontrunner Motorsport. It's time we take in the next batch of freshly baked Lotus drivers as we return to our list where we are ranking every Lotus Formula 1 driver ever from worst to best. Make sure you check out part 1 where we looked at the worst 16 drivers to ever race for the classic British marquee. Now on to part 2 and the next 15 drivers to go onto the list. We are starting to move away from the drivers who only did 1 or 2 races and into the point scorers now. Lotus had a lot of pay drivers throughout their time in Formula 1, sometimes having as many as 7 or 8 drivers a year. So there are a lot of drivers who only did a handful of races for the team. Lotus were the Formula 1 equivalent of handing out back alley handjobs. Quick thrills for cash, but often an ever so brief fling. Make sure you check out part 1 and subscribe, and let's jump into the video. Number 45, Jim Crawford. A British driver known more for his efforts in the Indy 500 than he was for his Formula 1 exploits, Jim Crawford joined Lotus after some strong performances in Formula Libre, but only did 2 races in Formula 1. He crashed out of the British Grand Prix, but put in a solid drive to finish 13th at Monza. That was it for Lotus in Formula 1, but Jim Crawford did go on to win the 1982 British Formula 1 Championship and played a starring role in the 1988 Indy 500. He ended his racing career in America in the mid-90s and sadly passed away in 2002. Number 44, Jeff Lees. Got his start in Formula 1 with the Mario Deliotti racing team, but failed to qualify in the team's only Formula 1 race entry. Jeff Lees also raced for Mario in the British Formula 1 series. Here he fared slightly better. He made his full-time debut with Tyrrell in 1979 with a single appearance, a 7th place at the German Grand Prix. Jeff Lees was a good driver who struggled to find a strong Formula 1 drive. He won 2 Macau Grand Prix in a row and the 1981 European Formula 2 Championship, but only managed to get F1 drives with Shadow, Ensign, Theodore Racing and Ram. His final appearance in Formula 1 was in a Lotus at the 1982 French Grand Prix, as a stand-in for Nigel Mansell. He put in a typically competent performance to finish 12th. He moved over to Japan, won the Japanese Formula 2 Championship, Class C of the All Japan Sports Prototype Series, and several Fuji Grand Slam Championships. He also raced at Le Mans for many years, mostly for Toyota, but he also raced a Nimrod, Lister Storms, and a BMW. He retired from racing in the early 2000s. Number 43, Bob Evans. With a name like Bob Evans, you'd expect him to be a plumber, not a Formula 1 driver. The 1974 Rothmans 5000 champion raced in Formula 1 for BRM during the other famous British Marquis's final years. In 1976, he was a Team Lotus reserve and test driver, but he got to make a couple of Formula 1 appearances for the team, a 10th place in South Africa, and a failure to qualify in the American Grand Prix, although he only missed out by 6 tenths. After his time in Formula 1, he would continue to race, mostly in sports cars, as well as finishing runner-up to Tony Trimmer in British F1. He was done by the mid-80s. Number 42, Moises Salazar. The Mexican was a star in his native country, with records that stand to this day. He made several Formula 1 appearances in Mexico and the USA between 1963 and 1968. Out of his 8 Formula 1 starts, 6 of them were for Lotus. He had a best finish of 10th in 1964 at Mexico, but he often qualified within the top 10 and was let down by mechanical issues. His final Formula 1 race was at the Mexican Grand Prix of 1968. Sadly, he was killed at a Mexican hill climb event in 1969. The first 3 Mexican Formula 1 drivers all took part around this time, and all were dead after fatal crashes by 1971. Number 41, Mika Salo. The Finn driver made his Formula 1 debut in 1994 for the final 2 races of the season, and for Team Lotus in general. In fact, Mika Salo was the final Team Lotus Formula 1 driver before their demise. Salo had finished runner-up to compatriot Mika Hakkinen in British Formula 3 in 1990, and then spent a few years in Japan before his start in Formula 1. Despite not having much to work with, Salo managed to bring the Lotus home in 10th in Japan, but failed to finish in Australia. He went on to start over 100 Formula 1 races for Tyrrell, BAR, Arrows, Sauber, Toyota, and most impressively of all, a stint at Ferrari, stepping in for the injured Michael Schumacher. He should have won the 1999 German Grand Prix, but had to make way for teammate Eddie Irvine, who was in with a shout of the championship. He went on to have success in sports cars and GT racing, including class wins at Le Mans, an American Le Mans GT Championship, and a Bathurst 12 Hours win in 2014. Number 40, Giacomo Russo. A talented Italian racer also known as Gecchi, He won several Italian Formula 3 championships but only made a few appearances on the world stage. He took part in 3 Grand Prix, qualifying for 2 of them at Monza. He finished 9th in a Lotus at the 1966 Italian Grand Prix, but sadly didn't get to show his racing talents much longer. He was killed in a horrifying Formula 3 crash that saw several drivers lose their lives in 1967. Number 39, Alberto Rodriguez Loretta. I have already covered this Argentine one-race wonder, but for the summary, successful in his native Argentina, Alberto Rodriguez Loretta got to drive a Lotus at his home Grand Prix in 1960. He did a decent job, qualifying 15th and finishing 9th overall. Colin Chapman apparently offered him a contract to continue racing for Lotus, but Loretta turned it down and continued racing in his homeland. He passed away in 1977. Number 38, Julian Bailey. Almost halfway through this list and we finally have a point scorer. I always had a soft spot for Julian Bailey, mostly due to his exploits in a Toyota in the BTCC. He was also a GT champion and had race wins in International F3000 and British GT. He was also one of Top Gear's Stigs. His time in Formula 1 was a brief and disappointing mess. He raced for Tyrrell in 1988, not one of their best years. Even so, Bailey was outperformed by Jonathan Palmer and failed to qualify for 10 races. He couldn't find a drive for 1989, so went off to Macau to finish 2nd in the Grand Prix and spent a couple of years racing in sports cars for Nissan before returning to Formula 1 in 1991 with Team Lotus. He failed to qualify for 3 of his 4 races, but at Imola he managed to finish 6th. That meant an F1 point, despite qualifying last and being 3 laps down. He was sent out of Formula 1 and racing in the BTCC, ending his racing career in the early 2000s. Number 37, Gearhard Mitter. The German was an early Nürburgring expert. He raced for several teams at the German Grand Prix between 1963 and 1969. He was a talented sports car racer, winning the Targa Floria, as well as his class in the Daytona 24 Hours. He raced for the Écurie Marsberg and Porsche F1 team in 1963 and managed to score points with a 4th place. His 2 appearances in Formula 1 for Lotus were the German Grand Prix of 1964 and 1965. He finished 9th in 64, but was doing better in 65 before a water leak ended his race. He'd enter a couple more German Grand Prix but never finished the race again. Gearhard Mitter was killed in practice for the 1969 German Grand Prix whilst driving a Formula 2 BMW. It was enough to keep BMW out of Formula 1 until they supplied engines to Brabham in 1981. Number 36, Pedro Rodriguez. Another talented Mexican driver, Pedro Rodriguez had his best Formula 1 results away from Lotus, taking wins for Cooper and BRM. He made his debut in Formula 1 for Lotus in 1963, but failed to finish in both the USA and Mexico. In 1966, he returned to Lotus and took part in his first Formula 1 races outside of the Americas. He failed to finish in all 6 of his starts for Lotus, but his performances in 1966 were a lot more competitive. He never raced full-time for Lotus, and ended up with only 2 full seasons in Formula 1 in 1968 and 1970. He finished 6th and 7th in the championship respectively. Outside of Formula 1, Pedro Rodriguez was an incredible sports car driver, having success on both sides of the Atlantic. He won the 24 Hours of Daytona and the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and many more races in between, before sadly losing his life in a sports car race at the Norrisring in 1971. Number 35, Alan Stacy. His racing career was brief, but he was a Lotus driver all the way. Alan Stacy only had 1 leg, having lost the other in a motorcycle accident when he was 17. He began racing Lotus sports cars before earning a full-time drive with Team Lotus in sports cars and single-seaters. He had success in sports cars, but Formula 1 never worked out for Stacy, failing to finish 6 of his 7 appearances. But he was a good driver who never really got a chance to shine. His best finish was an 8th place at the 1959 British Grand Prix. He lost his life in a crash at Spa in 1960, just minutes after Chris Bristow was killed in a crash at almost the exact same spot. There sure has been a lot of death in this video. Number 34, Pedro Lamy. The Portuguese driver was one of the last Team Lotus drivers, and so Lotus were not in a very healthy state when he joined. The 1992 German Formula 3 champion replaced Alessandro Zanardi after finishing runner-up in the 1993 International F3000 Championship. Lamy would race for Lotus in the last 4 races of 1993 and the first 4 of 1994. He scored no points but did at least finish a few races, 11th on debut at Monza, 10th in Brazil, 8th in Japan, and 11th in his final Lotus race at Monaco. Unfortunately, a massive crash in testing left him injured for a year, and he returned to Formula 1 with Lotus no longer part of the furniture. Pedro Lamy would have a year and a half with Minardi, scoring a point, but went on to become one of the best GT racers out there. Multiple class and overall podiums at Le Mans, FIA GT and Le Mans Series GT champion, and World Endurance GT champion as late as 2017 in an Aston Martin. Pedro Lamy was racing full-time as recently as 2020, but seems to have finally started to wind down his racing appearances. Number 33, David Walker. Australian David Walker was an absolute star of racing who just couldn't make it work in Formula 1. He raced in Australia in the 60s, but really made a name for himself dominating the British F3 scene in 1970 and 1971. He had a difficult relationship with Lotus, who clearly favoured Emerson Fittipaldi, but there were good appearances sprinkled in amongst mistakes and political infighting. He never scored points for Lotus and is in fact to this day the only driver to score 0 points when their teammate has won the World Championship, but that doesn't tell the full David Walker story. He went on for a couple of years in sports cars and Formula 5000, but was done by the end of 1976, and sadly he passed away just last year. Number 32, Ron Flockhart. The first time Ron Flockhart raced for Lotus, it was at Le Mans in a Lotus 9, shared with the boss Colin Chapman. Flockhart went on to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans twice in a Jaguar D-Type in 1956 and 1957. He was not a full-time Grand Prix driver, but made several appearances in Formula 1 for various teams. He got a podium in a Connaught at Monza in 1956, but also raced for BRM, Cooper and the Rob Walker team. He made one appearance in a Lotus, the 1960 French Grand Prix, and managed to finish 6th. He made one more appearance in a Cooper, and then left Motorsport behind. He was killed in a plane crash, whilst preparing to set a record for a flight from Sydney to London. Number 31, Richard Atwood. Our final driver for today's video is Richard Atwood. Primarily a sports car racer, Atwood did a few Grand Prix between 1964 and 1969. He never had a full-time drive, but did take a podium for BRM, and also drove for Cooper, Reg Parnell and Frank Williams. He made one appearance in a Lotus at the 1969 Monaco Grand Prix. It was a typically good performance from the man, starting 10th and finishing 4th, and on the lead lap. He also won at Le Mans in a Porsche in 1970 and retired from racing after a very successful 1971. So that was the second lot of drivers in the Ranking Every Team Lotus Formula 1 driver from worst to best list. A lot of death in this list. A lot of these drivers sadly lost their lives at a young age for one reason or another. Hopefully that won't be the case in future videos. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss part 3 of this series or any of the motorsport content coming out as 2025 starts to get into full swing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you put any of these drivers any higher or lower on this list? Have you picked a top 10 yet? Thank you very much for watching and have a good one.